Howdy! Welcome back to the American series. This is episode 28, and we're talking more about Texas. Last time we left off in Anahuac. We had a legal battle over 3 runaway slaves that somehow evolved into a lawyer and some other dude getting arrested by a wannabe military dictator. And then when the dude's bro came to save him, Dictator Man threatened to shoot both him and the lawyer. You may perhaps think that the 2 prisoners of Fort Anahuac were rather frightened. Not Travis. He was made of tougher stuff. From where he lay, Travis shouted to Frank W. Johnson and his followers to come and attack the fort anyway. He didn't care what happened to him at all. Thankfully for Travis, though, the Texans didn't make the charge. Rather, a parley was held, and a compromise was hit upon that would avoid any bloodshed at all. Bradburn agreed to move Travis and Jack into a regular jail for civilians, instead of keeping them in the fort's military prison. In return, the Texans would release the Mexican cavalry officers that they had captured. And then march away to Turtle Bayou, which lies clear across the other side of the Anahuac Lake. It was a simple and temporary agreement until further talks could be had. And perhaps it would have eventually brought peace, if both parties had respected the terms. As it was, neither side did as they promised. A handful of the Texan militiamen stayed behind in Anahuac. What they were doing, I have no idea. But it was certainly not a good sign to the easily angered Bradburn. As a result, he refused to move Travis and Jack to the jail, and instead threatened to turn his cannons loose upon the town. The Texans didn't budge. Cannonballs started flying accordingly, and the bordering Texans were sent running off to Turtle Bayou to join their friends. The news of the bombardment of Anahuac brought tempers running high again. The Texans proclaimed themselves Federalists on the side of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and drew their battle lines right then and there. Now, this makes little sense to you or me, unless we also understand what was going on just then in Mexico City. You see, the Mexican government was still suffering from the curse of unrest. In the eyes of some, the current president Bustamante was ruling with a hand much too heavy to their liking. These people began to cry out for a more federalist sort of republic. Santa Anna, that officer hero of Medina, saw in this an opportunity to gain power for himself. He quickly threw in his lot with the Federalists and made himself a great leader among them in a revolt. This, all at the same time that the trouble was going on in Anahuac, you see. And thus it was that since Bradburn was an anti-federalist on the side of President Bustamante, the Texans declared themselves Federalists in defiance of him, the hated law of April 6th, and the military rule of Texas. The battle lines were drawn, as I have said, but they weren't quite ready to fight yet. They had no cannons with which to meet the foe, which would make matters most difficult and unequal. So, John Austin, not any relation of Stephen Austin's, was sent off with a group of men back to Brazoria to get the artillery they needed. Bradburn, meanwhile, called in reinforcements from Nacogdoches. Dude, they didn't have texting back then. Nope, still quite a few decades off, buddy. You're just gonna have to stick with good old pen and paper. Or a mounted messenger. Passenger pigeon? Oh, and here's Nacogdoches if you want to get an idea of where he's sending to. Now, perhaps you remember Colonel Domingo Ugartechea from our last episode. That wise commander of Fort Velasco. The rescue team from Brazoria had passed him when they first set out to the aid of Jack and Travis. Well, as John Austin was returning to Brazoria, he must pass Fort Velasco again. "Come," John Austin called up to Domingo. "Come and join us for the freedom of Mexico! Triumph to the Federalists!" And Domingo's thinking like, "You Americanos are loco." He told John Austin that he wasn't coming. But John wasn't asking so much as he was demanding. Instead of going on about his own business of getting to Brazoria, he ordered his men to attack Fort Velasco. Domingo was forced to surrender. He and his men were let alone to march away, but they had to leave all their cannons behind. And so by this piece of sorry business, John Austin gained not a little. The guns were soon brought back to the new Federalists, waiting at Turtle Bayou. It was about this time that Bradburn's reinforcements arrived. Colonel Piedras, freshly arrived from the fort at Nacogdoches. It looked like things were about to get real nasty. But Piedras was coming in with a fresh mind and cool blood. He calmed Bradburn down and called for another parley with the Texans. This time, the Mexicans promised again that they would move Travis, Jack, and all their civilian prisoners out of the Fort Anahuac prison and into a regular jail. But more than this, they also arranged that Bradburn would be fired. With this, the Texans were quite satisfied. On their part, they agreed to disband for good. Of course, Bradburn was a bit disgruntled at being removed from his post, but there was nothing he could do or say about it. He stayed on in the fort, sulking. Though he probably smirked more than once to himself when the replacement commander Piedras chose refused to take the job. They weren't going to easily find a man with the guts like him to face those wily, rebellious Texans. Piedras was compelled to take command of Fort Anahuac himself for a few days, until he found a man willing to take the job. Lieutenant Cortina stood watching on the wall of his new fort as Piedras marched back to Nacogdoches. What did he have to fear? The threat of federalism was over here. Mexico City could deal with its own problems. So Cortina thought.